Okay, so in this video, I'm going to review the section that we left off on, which is the central nervous system. We did not get to a test on this, so I still want to do that. My plan is I'm going to put out 3 separate videos. First one is this one, and it's going to be just a review of the spinal cord and the meninges, and then I will send a second video which will be a review of the brain that we've done up to this point. And then a third and final video will be the new information I did not get to. There was not a lot left, but I still have to finish that up. And then, believe it or not, I'm going to try to give you guys a test. So we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, here is the first video, and this is a review of the central nervous system, specifically the spinal cord and the meninges. So let's get started. Okay, so the brain and spinal cord are the two components of the central nervous system. They're separate, but they are really one unified organ in my head. The brain and spinal cord are connected to each other, and the brain is going to be the portion that stays in the cranium, and then the spinal cord is going to be the portion that leaves the cranium and heads out to the body and allows the brain to communicate with the outside world and also the body itself. So, as many things, anything that's delicate, there needs to be some protection involved. So, the brain and spinal cord are protected by bone, obviously, the cranium and the vertebrae, but also there are 3 layers of membranes called the meninges. And they're called the dura mater, the pia mater, and the arachnoid mater. So, I'm going to run through those with you right now. So, the first layer is the dura mater, and that is going to be just below the cranium. It's actually attached to the underside of the cranium, and it is a thick, white, fibrous, this thing is tough, layer of connective tissue, which is there. It really looks like a white bag. I hope we get to go back to school, and I hope we get to dissect the brain because you will see how thick it is. It's really hard to tear. That is going to be your dura mater here. Just deep to that is going to be the arachnoid mater, and that is extremely thin, so thin that it doesn't have any blood vessels or nerves. But just deep to that is this space called the subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space is chock full of blood vessels. And that's where the blood comes from that gives the arachnoid mater its vascularity. And then finally, we have our pia mater, which is the very thin layer which sits right on the brain itself. It follows all these gyri and sulci. And that also has blood vessels and nerves. This is just an image. You've seen this before. I like this because it just shows you those layers. You can see you have your scalp here, which is going to be the epidermis. Just deep to that, if you peel that back, you're going to have your muscle layer. Your periosteum is going to be here. That's connective tissue on the outside of the bone. You have your cranium, which is going to be the skeletal layer. And then now we're going to get into the meningeal layer. So we have our dura mater, this white fibrous layer here. You can see it's got some blood vessels in there. Then we have our arachnoid mater just deep to that, which is going to also have the subarachnoid space. So that open area there is the subarachnoid space. And then you can't see it because it's actually on the brain, but the pia mater is going to be the layer that is on the brain tissue itself. This image here I like just because you can see a cross section. So you can see you got your pia mater on the brain. You have your subarachnoid space with the blood vessels here. And then we have our dura mater here. The arachnoid mater is this thin line right there. This open space is called the subdural sinus. And that is where you're going to have your cerebral spinal fluid is going to recollect actually at that point of the brain. And it's going to get reabsorbed by these little structures called the arachnoid granulations or arachnoid villi. And that is going to reabsorb that cerebral spinal fluid back into the system so that you don't get swelling on the brain. This is just kind of a reiteration of what I just said. You can see this is that subdural space here, and that is where you're going to have the possible buildup of blood during a subdural hematoma, or if there's inflammation of the meninges with either bacterial or viral meningitis, that is going to be building up right there. The brain does have some segments to it. It is made up mainly of neurons and neuroglial cells. It's got a lot of fat in there, but the brain does have some segments to it, and it's separated by these layers of dura, which actually will dive down into the fissures that separate the different lobes of the brain and keeps them partitioned from each other. So there's 3 of them. There's the falx cerebri, which is going to be going down the longitudinal fissure, and that is going to separate the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. Then we have you can see here the tentorium cerebelli is going to separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum, which you can't really see in this image. And then finally, we have the falx cerebelli, which is going to do the same thing that the falx cerebri does. It separates the cerebellum into a right and left hemisphere. So just make sure you're familiar with those terms. So the spinal cord does travel down the vertebrae, and there is a small space between the dura and the vertebrae, which is called the epidural space. In this diagram here, I colored it in. You can see this blue spot here. That is going to be the epidural space, and they will use that as a way to give an anesthetic to a patient where they don't want to knock them out entirely during a surgery. It's called local anesthetic. So, for example, if I'm getting surgery on the lower half of my body, or I'm giving birth, let's say I was able to do that, they could inject the anesthetic directly into that space, and then it will cause the patient to have no feeling from that point down. So it's a good way to administer anesthetic without having to have the patient under full general anesthetic. So we already talked about that. The actual spinal cord itself has got 31 segments to it. Each one of those segments has a spinal nerve which goes off to a different part of the body. And that is how the brain communicates with the body and how the body communicates with the brain. It is also the area that controls our reflexes. So a lot of your body's functions don't actually involve the brain. They get handled at the spinal level, and those are going to be your reflexes. In terms of just the anatomy of the spinal cord, it starts at what's called the foramen magnum. That is the opening in the bottom of the cranium and the occipital bone that allows the spinal cord to exit. And it travels all the way down spinal cord, all the way down the vertebral foramen of the spinal column of the vertebrae, until it hits about the L2, L3. That is where you're going to have your conus medullaris. That is the official end of the spinal cord. However, there is an extension called the cauda equina, which is made up of some connective tissue and spinal nerves, and that is what travels down to the legs and lower part of the body. And yeah, okay. The spinal cord itself does have, if you look here at this image, this is a transverse cut of the spinal cord, and you can see that there are two distinct regions. There's the gray matter, which is often called the butterfly or the horns, the gray horns, and they are going to be on the right and left side. There's going to be two of them, and just like the brain, there's two hemispheres of the spinal cord. They are separated from each other by these two structures. On the posterior surface, we have the posterior median sulcus, and on the anterior surface, we have the anterior median fissure, and that just keeps the right and left halves of the spinal cords separate from each other. You can see there's a spinal nerve coming in, and that spinal nerve is going to be bringing sensory nerve information from the posterior side, and then in this gray matter is where you're going to find your interneurons, where they're going to communicate with the motor neuron coming out of the anterior surface. One thing I didn't bring up on that other slide is the white matter is going to be your funiculi, and that is going to be the myelinated neurons. So these neurons have the fatty myelin that allow the information to travel very quickly up and down the spinal cord, where this middle area here is unmyelinated because interneurons don't have myelin. They're very small, they don't need myelin, and the information just transfers. In the middle, we have our central canal. That is where the cerebral spinal fluid is going to flow down the spinal cord. And then finally, the gray commissure is going to be this little connecting piece of gray matter between the right and left horns of the gray matter. Neurons travel down and up the spinal cord in something called nerve tracts. So we have two of them. We have ascending and descending. To ascend means to go up, to descend means to go down, and that is why they're named that way. So the ascending tracts are going to be bringing sensory information from the body to the brain. So I put my hand into something soft and warm, or I step on something that feels weird. That information is going to get sent up my ascending pathways until it hits the medulla oblongata, which is at the base of the brainstem. And at that point, the neurons, the fibers cross over. The same thing is true for our descending fibers. So these are the fibers going from the motor cortex of the brain down to the body in order to move. So I step in something that feels weird. The ascending tracts bring the information up to my sensory cortex. That gets assessed by my brain, and then my motor cortex is going to send the information down to my leg muscles to move my leg. So that is done through the descending pathways, and they also cross over. So for example, if my right foot steps in something weird, the left side of my brain is going to be interpreting that and also eliciting the movement to get me out of that situation. So just remember, it crosses over at the medulla, and again, we don't really understand why. Reflexes, what you need to know about reflexes is the basic idea that a reflex is not going to involve the brain. So this is information that gets handled at the spinal level. They are going to be things like your sneeze reflex, cough reflex, heart rate, breathing, the withdrawal reflex. When you step on something sharp or hot, you don't think about it, you just move. And that is all controlled by your reflexes. In terms of the pathway, you need to know the parts of a reflex arc here. You can see you have, let's say, for example, this is a muscle here. So we'll say it's your quadricep muscle, just for the sake of this scenario. You have a receptor, which is going to be on the tendon. When something in, some form of a stimulus excites that receptor, it's going to send the information through the spinal neuron, which is going to be unicellular, to the interneuron, which is going to be in the spinal cord itself. So remember, this is the gray matter. That's the interneuron. The interneuron is either going to excite or inhibit the pathway. So in the case here, it's going to excite it. So this information travels to the sensory neuron, to the interneuron, and then the interneuron is going to stimulate the motor neuron to send a motor impulse through acetylcholine. That's the excitatory neurotransmitter. That is going to trigger the muscle to contract. So that's going to be our effector. So it goes receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, effector. The only a couple instances where there's no interneuron would be like the patellar reflex. That is why when you hit your patellar tendon, your leg kicks so quickly. There is no interneuron. It's just sensory neuron, right to motor neuron. In terms of the peripheral nervous system, we're not really talking about that in this unit, but just quick overview here. There are two branches of your central nervous system that are peripheral, somatic and autonomic. Somatic is what you control, so all of the movements, your voluntary movements. And then the autonomic is going to be everything you do not control. So these are your subconscious actions, and that is broken into two divisions as well. Sympathetic is when you are in a fight or flight response. Parasympathetic is called rest and digest, because that is when you're not in a stimulated situation where you need to escape. And that is going to be your body's just working on digestion, keeping the homeostatic levels where you want them to be. And last bit here, ventricles. Not much you need to know about the ventricles. Just know there's 4 ventricles in the brain. There's the 2 lateral ventricles. That is where you're going to have your choroid plexus. That is where the cerebral spinal fluid gets produced. The cerebral spinal fluid fills up, travels down to the midline, which is going to be your 3rd ventricle. Then finally, it travels down to the 4th ventricle, which is next to the cerebellum. And then it travels down the central canal, back up the outside of the subarachnoid space, around the brain where it bathes the brain in cerebral spinal fluid. And then any excess cerebral spinal fluid is going to get absorbed by these little arachnoid granulations, and that's going to send that cerebral spinal fluid back into the blood supply. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, so I'm skipping through this. And then last bit here, a lumbar puncture is just a tool. It's a diagnostic tool to see if there's anything going on in a patient's cerebral spinal fluid. You can test for meningitis. You can test for a tumor. You can test even for early onset Alzheimer's. And they go in and they're just basically looking at the pressure of the cerebral spinal fluid. Is there too much? Is there too little? Are there any bacteria in there? Is there any blood? Which shouldn't be blood in there. That's what they're looking for. And finally, a patient that has hydrocephaly, that is when there's a buildup of cerebral spinal fluid and the patient needs a shunt. And what happens is that shunt will take the excess cerebral spinal fluid that is produced in the ventricles and just channel it to go either into the abdominal cavity or into the bladder, and the patient will just urinate it out, or it'll get reabsorbed by the body. And if everything's done right and that shunt is in place, it should not be a problem, and it should keep that to a minimum. Okay, and that's everything I have for that first portion. So I'm going to send out another video, and it'll be shorter. It'll be on the brain we've done up to this point, and then I'll do a final video, which will be the last part of the brain, which I did not cover yet. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good day.